We'll now look into how we can create classes, how we can create instances of classes, and how we can initialize them as we're creating these instances. So when we studied modules a while ago in the screencast, we saw that they really combine methods, meaning functions or behavior, and constants under one namespace. So modules already gave us a form of encapsulation. We were able to collect behaviors that somehow belonged together, as well as the constants they used, under one namespace. Now classes take this one step further in that they are modules, meaning they are collections of behavior and have encapsulation capabilities, but they also encapsulate the data these methods operate on. So when we have classes, we can form instances or objects that each have their own state, but otherwise follow the class's blueprint. So the class defines a blueprint in terms of the data and the behavior for this particular instance or object. And when we create an instance, we can initialize that instance's data state into a state we want to have. And we'll now see how this actually happens in a concrete example of our Middle-earth blog. So we start with the author class. And as you can see here, class names are capitalized. So the first letter is always a capital letter. And then within the scope defined by the class, we are able to define methods. Now there's one special method called initialize, which is always used to set the state of a fresh instance of the class. In Java, you would look at this as the constructor, but what actually happens is that when the constructor is called in Ruby, it then uses initialize to set the data state of the instance. In the example of our author class, we want to have two instance variables, the name and the location, that is in both cases per author instance. And so in Ruby, we define instance variables by prefixing them with an @ symbol. So @name is an instance variable unique to each instance of the author class. And similarly, @location is an instance variable unique to each instance of the author class. Now we use initialize to take the provided name and initialize the instance variable, and similarly so for the location. And remember that we can use initial values or default values for the parameters of the method, which we exploit here as well. Note that when we create an instance variable, it is actually dynamically created the first time we assign to it. So here we are introducing the location instance variable by assigning a value to it, and that dynamically creates this variable within the instance of the class. Once we've created the class, we can instantiate objects of the class by calling upon the class's new method. So what you see here is that we create a new instance of the author class, and we initialize the instance by giving values for the name and location, which then, as Ruby calls initialize, will be substituted for these parameters here and thereby initialize the instance variables that we have defined for the class. And so here we capture two new instances, one called Bilbo and one called Frodo, and both are instances of the author class, initialized differently in terms of the name and the location. So let's try this out in the IRB. We define our author class. And the initialize method in it with the parameters name and location. And we dynamically create the instance variable at name and assign to it the value passed into the initialize method, and similarly for location. And we end the initialize method and we end the class definition. And now we can create a variable Bilbo to hold a new object of class author. And we pass in the name Bilbo as a string, and again as a string Shire as the location. And now we see that Ruby has created a new object of the class author with the given name. We can do the same thing with Frodo. So now we have two separate objects of the author class. So both are of class author, but you can see here the object identifier, and it's different. So we have indeed two separate objects. And if you look at the instance variables, they carry different values as well. So the first instance has Bilbo as the name, the second one has Frodo as the name, the first has Shire as the location, and the second one has Mordor as the location. Now, an interesting question is, how do we get to the instance variables? And if you're coming from Java, you might be tempted to write something like Bilbo.location, but you will see now that this results in an error. And the reason for this is that Ruby expects a method call if you use the dot notation. So it is looking up for a method called location, and it can't find it. So our next step will be to find out a way how we can access the instance variables of an object.